At 0530 on December 16, 1944, First Lieutenant Lyle Boo crouched inside a frozen foxhole on Lanzarote Ridge, observing a column of roughly 500 German paratroopers emerging from the forest below his position in Belgium. He was 20 years old, had been in combat for just 3 months, and knew that no reinforcements were coming. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment was advancing toward his 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon with orders to clear the Losheim Gap for the entire 1st SS Panzer Division advancing behind them. The first day of the Battle of the Bulge had begun 90 minutes earlier with 1,600 German artillery pieces firing across an 80-mile front. Boo's platoon occupied the only American position defending the vital road junction at Lanzarote. Behind them stretched open roads leading directly to Allied supply depots and headquarters. The 99th Infantry Division's front line had been stretched so thin that Boo's reconnaissance unit had been ordered to hold a 5-mile gap meant for an entire battalion. No reserves were available. The nearest American unit was 6 miles away at Buchholz Station. Boo immediately understood the mathematics of his situation. His platoon was equipped with standard infantry weapons, M1 Garand rifles, 1 Browning automatic rifle per squad, and a single .30 caliber M1919 machine gun, facing 500 elite German paratroopers advancing in column formation across snow-covered fields. Those weapons alone would not be enough. German intelligence had assessed American soldiers as reluctant to fight without armor or air support. The Wehrmacht expected to break through this sector in less than 2 hours and reach the Meuse River by nightfall. The 99th Infantry Division had arrived in the Ardennes only 1 month earlier, and most of its units lacked combat experience. During the first week of December, the division had already lost 47 men killed in action during limited patrol operations. Battalion commanders knew their inexperienced troops would suffer catastrophic losses if the Germans launched a major offensive. Every soldier in Boo's platoon understood what happened to reconnaissance units that were overrun. 11 had already been lost elsewhere. Thompson knew the pattern. Boo radioed regimental headquarters at Hunningen and requested permission to withdraw. The response came back within 2 minutes: remain in position, reinforcements from 3rd Battalion would support them. But Boo knew no reinforcements would arrive in time. The German advance had already severed telephone lines throughout the sector. His SCR-300 radio was the only remaining link to American forces. For days earlier, Boo had made a decision that violated standard reconnaissance doctrine. He had traded captured German identity cards to the regimental ordnance officer in exchange for an armored jeep mounting a Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun. The M2 fired 12.7 mm rounds at 550 rounds per minute, had an effective range exceeding 1,800 meters, could penetrate light armor, and suppress infantry assaults across open ground. Boo positioned the jeep at the center of his defensive line behind 9 foxholes his men had dug into the hillside. The jeep represented his platoon's only heavy weapon. Everything now depended on whether 18 men with rifles and a single .50 caliber machine gun could delay 500 attacking paratroopers long enough to disrupt the German offensive. Boo checked his watch. It was 0645. The German artillery barrage had ended 15 minutes earlier. Through the morning fog, he could see the Fallschirmjäger forming assault waves at the base of the ridge. His men took their positions in reinforced foxholes. For forward artillery observers from Battery C, 371st Field Artillery Battalion, prepared to call for fire support. A barbed wire fence crossing the snow-covered field below would slow the German advance but would not stop it. Boo knew the first assault wave would reach his position within minutes. He gave the order to hold fire until the enemy closed to 75 yards. 0700 on December 16. The lead elements of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment began advancing uphill toward Lanzarote Ridge. 500 German paratroopers against 18 American soldiers and 1 jeep-mounted machine gun. By nightfall, one side would control the road junction. The other would be dead or captured. The German paratroopers advanced in 3 separate waves across the open field below Boo's position. Each wave consisted of approximately 170 men moving in loose formation through knee-deep snow. The lead wave reached the barbed wire fence 75 yards from the American foxholes. Boo gave the order to open fire at 0715. The Browning M2 on the jeep fired first. The gunner had pre-registered his fields of fire during the previous night. The .50 caliber rounds tore through the German formation at 2,840 feet per second. Each projectile carried enough kinetic energy to penetrate body armor at 1,500 yards. At 75 yards, the results were devastating. The first burst killed 11 paratroopers in the lead squad. The survivors dove for cover behind the fence. WWII's riflemen opened fire simultaneously with their M1 Garand. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon had been selected specifically because every man qualified as an expert marksman. Several had attended college before the war through the Army Specialized Training Program. Their fire discipline proved critical during the opening minutes of contact. While standard infantry units fired in volleys, WWII's men aimed at individual targets. German soldiers attempting to cut through the barbed wire became priority targets. After 8 minutes of sustained fire, the first assault wave withdrew. WWII counted 23 bodies lying in the snow between the fence and the treeline. The Germans had expected minimal resistance from what intelligence had identified as a thin screening force. Instead, they encountered precision rifle fire and heavy machine gun support from fortified positions. The commander of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment ordered his men to regroup at the base of the ridge. At 0745, the second German assault wave advanced. This time, the paratroopers altered their tactics, sending squads forward to provide covering fire while assault teams attempted to flank the American position through the woods on both sides of the ridge. WWII directed his Browning automatic rifle teams to cover the flanks while the M2 continued firing into the open field. The 4 forward artillery observers from the 371st Field Artillery called for fire support. Lieutenant Warren Springer radioed coordinates for a barrage on the German assembly area at the bottom of the hill. No artillery arrived. American batteries were fully engaged across the front responding to the massive German offensive. The 99th Infantry Division's artillery support had been allocated to sectors where entire regiments were under attack. WWII's platoon would receive no indirect fire support. The second assault lasted 19 minutes. German MG-42 machine guns established firing positions along the treeline and began suppressing the American foxholes with sustained fire at 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was unmistakable. American soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. But the Germans could not advance while the M2 remained operational. Every attempt to cross the open ground resulted in immediate casualties. The snow-covered field offered no concealment. The second wave withdrew at 0804. WWII assessed his ammunition supply. His men had fired approximately 400 rounds during the first 2 assaults. Each soldier carried 80 rounds in clips and bandoliers. At the current rate of expenditure, the platoon would run out of rifle ammunition before noon. The M2 had expended 200 rounds of its initial 550 round load. The gunner reported that the barrel temperature was nearing operational limits. The Germans paused their assault for 37 minutes. During that time, WWII observed enemy troops massing at 3 separate positions around the base of the ridge. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment was preparing a coordinated attack from multiple directions. His 18-man platoon would now have to defend against simultaneous assaults on the front and both flanks. The odds had worsened significantly. At 0841 on December 16, 500 German paratroopers prepared for their third assault on Lanzarote Ridge. WWII's men had less than half their ammunition remaining. The M2's barrel glowed red from sustained firing, and reinforcements were still 6 miles away with no means of reaching the isolated platoon. The next assault would determine whether 18 Americans could continue holding the most critical road junction in the northern sector of the Battle of the Bulge. The third German assault began at 0841 with coordinated advances from 3 directions. 2 squads moved through dense woods on the eastern flank while the main force attacked across the open field. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment committed approximately 350 men to this wave. Their doctrine emphasized overwhelming force at the point of contact, and German officers expected to overrun the American position within 15 minutes. WWII positioned his 2 Browning automatic rifle teams to engage the flanking squads moving through the woods. The bar fired .30 caliber rounds at 550 rounds per minute from 20-round magazines. In close-quarters forest fighting, the weapon provided effective suppressive fire, but its limited magazine capacity required constant reloading. The flanking team slowed but did not stop. The M2 continued engaging targets in the open field. The gunner switched to short, controlled bursts to manage barrel temperature, 3-round bursts every 4 seconds. This reduced the rate of fire from 550 rounds per minute to approximately 120, but accuracy improved dramatically. Each burst targeted specific German soldiers advancing through the snow. The psychological impact proved as important as the casualties. Paratroopers who saw their squad leaders cut down by .50 caliber fire lost momentum in the assault. At 0900, a German mortar team established a firing position at the tree line and began launching high-explosive rounds into the American foxholes, the 8 cm mortar. Shells impacted in the snow around Boo's defensive line. Most detonated harmlessly against the frozen ground or pine logs covering the foxholes, but the explosions forced his riflemen to take cover, reducing their rate of accurate fire. The Germans had finally brought indirect fire support into the engagement. Technical Sergeant Peter Gacki from the Forward Artillery Observer Team attempted to call for counter-battery fire against the German mortar. Position. His radio transmission reached the 371st Field Artillery Battalion command post, but every American artillery battery in the sector had received priority fire missions. Supporting units facing larger German assaults, the Battle of the Bulge involved over 410,000 German troops attacking along an 80m front. Boo's 18-man platoon represented one small position in a massive offensive. Artillery support would not arrive. The eastern flank assault penetrated to within 40 yards of the American foxholes before the bar team stopped it. Private First Class William James fired 3 complete magazines in rapid succession, hitting 11 German paratroopers. The attackers withdrew back into the woods at 0917. German casualties from the flanking attempt totaled 19 killed or wounded. The snow made it impossible for the paratroopers to maneuver without exposing their positions. In the open field, the main assault wave had stalled at the barbed wire fence. The M2 maintained suppressive fire across the killing zone. Every German soldier who attempted to cut the wire became a target. Bodies accumulated along the fence line. The American gunner estimated he had fired 420 rounds since the battle began at 0715. Approximately 130 rounds remained in the ammunition boxes. At the current rate of expenditure, the M2 would run dry before 1,100 hours. Viewed regimental headquarters again at 0930. He reported his ammunition status and requested immediate resupply. The response indicated no supply convoy could reach Lanzarote while German forces controlled the roads. His platoon would need to conserve ammunition and hold position with existing resources. The order remained unchanged. Do not withdraw. The 3rd German assault wave withdrew at 0943 after 62 minutes of continuous combat. Boo counted 41 enemy casualties visible in the snow between the Trien and his defensive position. The actual German losses were higher. Wounded paratroopers had been pulled back during the assault. The 9th Fehler Regiment had now attacked 3 times against the platoon-sized American unit and failed to achieve breakthrough on each attempt, but the mathematics were inexorable. Boo's men had fired approximately 900 rounds of rifle ammunition. Each soldier had less than 30 rounds remaining. The M2 had 130 rounds left. The next German assault would probably be the last one his platoon could effectively resist. And through his binoculars, Boo could see German officers gathering their troops at the bottom of the ridge for a 4th attack. The 4th German assault commenced at 1017. The 9th Fehler Regiment commander had reorganized his battalion into a single concentrated wave. Approximately 400 paratroopers advanced simultaneously across the entire width of the ridge. The tactic abandoned flanking maneuvers in favor of overwhelming the American defensive line through sheer numbers. German doctrine called this method punct concentration of force at the decisive point. Boo watched the assault develop. through his binoculars. The German formation stretched 200 yards across the snow-covered field. Individual soldiers maintained 10-yard intervals between positions. The spacing reduced casualties from machine gun fire, but made coordination difficult. Smoke grenades created concealment patches across the battlefield. The paratroopers had learned from 3 previous failed assaults. This attack demonstrated professional adaptation under fire. The M2 opened fire at 150 yards. The gunners selected targets on the flanks first, attempting to compress the German formation toward the center where rifle fire could achieve maximum effect. The 50 caliber rounds punched through the smoke, hitting paratroopers who believed they had concealment, but the barrel temperature had reached critical levels. After firing 60 rounds, the gunner reported decreased accuracy. The weapon continued functioning, but dispersion had increased significantly. Boo's riflemen engaged targets at 100 yards. Each man selected individual Germans and fired aim shots. The expert marksmanship that defined the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon proved decisive during this phase of combat. While the M2 provided suppressive fire, the rifles inflicted the majority of casualties. 16 Americans, firing M1 Garands in semi-automatic mode, could deliver approximately 120 accurate rounds per minute against targets in open terrain. The German formation reached the barbed wire fence at 10:29. Paratroopers carrying wire cutters moved forward under covering fire from MG-42. Teams positioned at the tree line. For the first time during the battle, German soldiers successfully breached the wire obstacle. 3 separate teams cut passages through the fence. The assault wave surged through the gaps toward the American foxholes. At 10:32, the M2 fired its final belt of ammunition. The gunner had rationed the remaining 130 rounds across 15 minutes of combat. When the weapon went silent, the psychological impact rippled across both sides of the battlefield. German paratroopers who had spent 3 hours ducking 50 caliber fire recognized the change immediately. Their rate of advance accelerated. American riflemen increased their fire rate to compensate for the loss of their heavy weapon. Booed his men to fix bayonets. The German assault had penetrated to within 50 yards of the defensive line. Individual paratroopers were clearly visible through the thinning smoke. Some carried stick grenades. Others prepared to rush the foxholes with submachine guns. The battle had transitioned from long-range precision fire to close-quarters combat. Every American soldier understood what happened when German assault troops reached defensive positions. Private First Class Robert Lambert fired his last clip at 10:38. He reached for his ammunition bandolier and found it empty. Around the defensive perimeter, other soldiers reported similar situations. The platoon had expended approximately 1,200 rounds of rifle ammunition during 4 hours of sustained combat. Less than 200 rounds remained distributed across 18 men. Some soldiers had 5 rounds left. Others had 15. None had enough ammunition to sustain defensive fire for more than 3 minutes. The forward artillery observers made one final attempt to reach American artillery support. Technical Sergeant Peter Gocki transmitted coordinates for fire missions against the German assembly areas and the MG-42 positions suppressing the American line. The 371st Field Artillery Battalion acknowledged the transmission, but could not allocate guns to support Lanzarote Ridge. Every available artillery piece was engaged, supporting regiment-sized units facing German armor and infantry assaults across the entire Ardennes front. At 10:45 on December 16, the 4th German assault reached maximum intensity. 400 paratroopers pressed against defensive positions held by 18 Americans armed with less than 200 rifle rounds and no heavy weapons. The M2 sat silent on its jeep mount. The barrel had discolored from heat stress. Boo knew his
Platoon could resist for perhaps 10 more minutes before ammunition ran out completely. The 9th Faller Regiment
had suffered over 90 casualties attacking this single ridge position. But the German commanders understood the
mathematics.
The Americans had to run out of ammunition eventually, and when they did, 500 paratroopers would overrun
18 riflemen in minutes. Behind the German assault force, the 1st SS Panzer Division waited for the infantry
to clear the road junction so their tanks could advance toward the Meuse River.
Everything depended on the next 10 minutes at Lanzarote Ridge.
The German paratroopers breached the
American defensive perimeter at 10:53. A squad of 12 Fallschirmjäger penetrated between two foxholes on the eastern flank where ammunition had run out first.
The soldiers in those positions had fired their last rounds 2 minutes earlier.
They engaged the Germans with hand grenades and entrenching tools. 1. American soldier used his rifle as a club.
Close quarters fighting in a defensive position against trained
assault infantry rarely ended well for the defenders. WWII redirected 3
riflemen from the center of the line to contain the breach.
These men still had ammunition.
They fired at point blank
range into the German squad that had penetrated the perimeter. 7 paratroopers withdrew back toward the wire, but the breach had demonstrated a critical vulnerability. Once the Americans ran out of ammunition, the Germans would overrun the position in minutes, regardless of courage or tactical skill. At 11:09, WWII made a decision that violated every principle of reconnaissance unit doctrine. Instead of
attempting to withdraw or conserve his remaining ammunition for a final stand, he ordered his men to maintain maximum
rate of fire. The tactic seemed counterintuitive. Expending ammunition faster would shorten the time until
complete depletion, but WWII understood the psychological dimension of the engagement.
As long as his platoon
maintained heavy fire, the Germans would believe significant defensive capacity remained. The riflemen fired as rapidly as they could acquire targets. M1 Garand rifles operated on a semi-automatic gas
system that cycled automatically after each shot.
A trained soldier could fire
40 accurate rounds per minute if he had sufficient ammunition and targets. 4. The next 8 minutes, WWII's remaining 14 men with ammunition delivered sustained precision fire against the German assault.
The paratroopers interpreted the increased fire rate as evidence of fresh ammunition supplies or
reinforcements.
The 4th German assault wave withdrew at 11:21.
The 9th Fokum Regiment had
committed its entire battalion to 4 separate attacks over 4 hours. Casualties now totaled 92 men killed,
wounded, or missing. Officers reported to their division commander that the American position at Lanzarote Ridge
appeared to be held by a reinforced company with heavy weapon support.
German intelligence had failed to identify the true size of the defending force.
The Wehrmacht believed it was attacking a well-supplied defensive
position rather than 18 men nearly out of ammunition. WWII conducted an ammunition count at 11:30. The results were catastrophic. His entire platoon possessed 73 rounds of rifle ammunition.
Some men had none, others had 5 or 6 rounds.
The M2 remained silent with empty ammunition boxes scattered around the jeep.
The forward artillery observers had exhausted their rifle
ammunition as well.
22 Americans held the most critical road junction in the northern sector of the Battle of the Bulge with 73 rifle rounds. The temperature had dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow
continued falling across the ridge.
WWII's men had been in combat positions since 0530 without food or water.
Several
soldiers showed symptoms of cold injury.
Private First Class Risto Malovich reported numbness in his feet. Technical
Sergeant William Slate had minor shrapnel wounds from German mortar fire, but no American had been killed.
1.
Forward artillery observer, technician 5th grade Billy Queen, had taken a bullet through his shoulder, but remained at his position. At 11:45, BU observed German officers gathering at the tree line with what appeared to be reinforcements. The 9th Fallschirm Regiment was being augmented with
additional troops from Division Reserve.
Through his binoculars, he counted approximately 200 fresh paratroopers moving into assault positions.
The Germans were preparing a fifth attack with rested troops against defenders who
had 73 rounds of ammunition remaining.
Viewed regimental headquarters and
reported his situation.
The response came back within 1 minute.
The 3rd Battalion could not reach Lanzarote.
German forces had cut all roads into the sector.
Artillery support remained unavailable. The order stood unchanged.
Hold position. Do not withdraw. Bu acknowledged the transmission and returned to his foxhole. The reality was stark.
His platoon had delayed the German offensive for over 6 hours. They had inflicted nearly 100 casualties on
an elite airborne unit. But the mathematics of ammunition consumption versus attacking force size could not be overcome indefinitely.
When the 5th German assault came, probably within the next 30 minutes, 18 Americans with 73
rifle rounds would face 400 fresh paratroopers. The outcome was no longer in doubt. At 12:15 on December 16, 1944, Lyle Bu watched German assault troops form up for their fifth attack on Lanzarote Ridge.
His men had fought longer and harder than anyone had expected, but physics and mathematics
were about to determine the battle's conclusion. The question was no longer whether the Germans would take the position. The question was how many more hours BU's platoon could delay the 1st SS Panzer Division's advance toward the Neuse River.
The 5th German assault began at 12:37. Approximately 400 paratroopers advanced in a modified formation that emphasized rapid movement over spacing.
The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment had committed its reserve companies to this attack.
Fresh troops who had not participated in the previous 4 assaults moved across the snow-covered field with the confidence of soldiers who believed they
faced a depleted enemy. German intelligence continued to overestimate American strength on the ridge. Bu
distributed the remaining 73 rounds of ammunition across his platoon. Soldiers with marksmanship qualifications
received priority. Men without ammunition were instructed to collect rifles and bandoliers from casualties if the opportunity presented itself.
The defensive plan had simplified to its most basic form:
shoot until ammunition runs out, then fight with bayonets and grenades. There were no other options available. The American riflemen held fire until the Germans reached 60 yards.
At that range, every round had to count.
The first volley dropped 11 paratroopers. The Germans immediately went to ground and began returning fire
with rifles and MG-42 machine guns, but without the suppressive fire of the M2.
The Americans could not prevent the German advance from gaining ground incrementally.
Squad by squad, the paratroopers moved forward through the snow using fire and maneuver tactics.
At 12:51, 3 German soldiers reached a foxhole on the western flank where the occupants had expended their ammunition.
The Americans fought with entrenching
tools and fists. 1 paratrooper fell with a fractured skull.
The other 2 withdrew after sustaining knife wounds. But the incident demonstrated how close the battle had come to hand-to-hand combat across the entire defensive line. The Germans were now within grenade range of multiple positions. Bu counted his remaining rounds.
16, around the
perimeter. His men were down to similar levels.
Some soldiers had already fixed bayonets in preparation for the final phase of combat.
The forward artillery observers continued calling for fire support even though no artillery would
arrive. Technical Sergeant Peter Gocki transmitted targeting data every 5 minutes as if repetition might somehow produce results. It did not. The German
assault gained momentum at 1300.
Paratroopers had breached the wire barrier at 4 separate points. Small groups of 3 to 5 men moved toward the American foxholes using smoke grenades for concealment. The defenders fired their remaining ammunition at these assault teams. Each round killed or wounded a German soldier, but the mathematics remained inexorable. 73 rounds divided by 400 attackers meant the vast majority of Germans would reach the American line unharmed. At 1,314,
Private First Class William James fired the last round from his M1 Garand. The distinctive ping of the ejecting clip signaled an empty rifle. He reached for
his bayonet and prepared for close combat.
Around the defensive perimeter, other soldiers were reaching the same point.
The Battle of Lanzarote Ridge had entered its final minutes as an ammunition-based defense. What happened
next would depend on hand grenades and edged weapons.
Boo fired his final rounds. At 1,317,
18 rifle bullets remained distributed among 22 Americans.
The M2 sat silent on its jeep mount. Forward artillery observers had exhausted all ammunition for their carbines. For the first time in 6 hours of uninterrupted combat, American defensive fire diminished to scattered, isolated shots. German officers noticed the change immediately and ordered their assault teams forward.
At 1,320 hours, roughly 50 German paratroopers surged toward the American foxholes at once from 3 directions. The defenders hurled grenades and fired their final rifle rounds. Several Germans went down, but the assault wave closed to within 20 yards of the defensive line. Boo could see individual faces now, young men in their 20s, seasoned soldiers executing textbook assault doctrine against a position they had been ordered to seize 6 hours earlier. The Americans prepared for a last stand.
Bayonets were fixed, grenades primed, entrenching tools raised.
Every man understood that the next 2 minutes would decide whether they lived or died. The Wehrmacht was not known for taking prisoners from units that had inflicted heavy losses.
92 German paratroopers had already been killed or wounded attacking this ridge. The survivors would not be inclined toward mercy.
At 13:23 on December 16, the Battle of Lanzarote Ridge reached its climax. 50 German assault troops closed in on 18 American defenders who had no ammunition remaining. The 6-hour fight that had delayed the entire northern wing of the Battle of the Bulge was about to end in brutal close-quarters combat on a frozen Belgian hillside. The German paratroopers overran the first American foxhole at 13:26. 3 Fallschirmjäger leapt into the position where 2 soldiers had expended their last rounds.
Hand-to-hand combat lasted 8 seconds. 1 German fell with a bayonet driven through his chest.
The 2 Americans sustained knife wounds but continued fighting.
A German officer dragged one of them from the foxhole at gunpoint.
The Wehrmacht had finally breached the defensive perimeter after 6 hours of sustained assault.
Additional German troops flooded through the gap.
Boo ordered his men to cease fire and surrender. Continuing resistance without ammunition would only lead to unnecessary deaths among soldiers who had already accomplished far more than anyone had expected. At 1,332 hours, 18 Americans from the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon and 4 forward artillery observers raised their hands. The Battle of Lanzarote Ridge ended after 7 hours and 57 minutes of continuous combat. German casualties were immediately visible across the snow-covered battlefield.
92 bodies lay between the treeline and the American foxholes.
Some had fallen at the barbed wire fence, others had been killed during successive assault waves. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment had lost 16% of its combat strength attacking a position defended by just 22 men. Battalion commanders reported to division headquarters that they had overcome a reinforced American company supported by heavy weapons. Technical Sergeant William Slate had suffered shrapnel wounds during the battle but remained mobile. 14 other members of Boo's platoon were wounded by rifle fire, grenade fragments, or mortar shrapnel. Only 1 American had been killed. Technician 5th grade Billy Queen from the forward artillery observer team died while manning a machine gun position during the 4th German assault. The casualty ratio stood at 92 Germans killed or wounded versus 1 American killed and 14 wounded. The German soldiers who captured the position expressed astonishment at the small size of the defending force. A Fallschirmjäger sergeant examined the silent M2 mounted on the jeep and asked Boo how many machine guns his unit possessed. When Boo indicated the single .50 caliber weapon, the sergeant refused to believe him. German doctrine held that sustained heavy machine gun fire required multiple weapons with overlapping fields of fire and constant ammunition resupply. The idea that one gun operated by exhausted soldiers could generate such defensive power contradicted their training. At 1,400 hours, the German battalion commander arrived at the captured position. He ordered his medical personnel to treat American and German wounded alike. The Fallschirmjäger established aid stations in homes within Lanzarote village. WWII and his men received medical care for their wounds before being prepared for transport to prisoner-of-war facilities. The German officer who accepted WWII's surrender acknowledged that the American defense had been conducted with professional skill. The tactical consequences of the 7-hour battle became clear over the following hours. The lead element of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Kampfgruppe, had been scheduled to pass through Lanzarote at 0800. The armored column consisted of 4,800 men, 600 vehicles, and more than 100 tanks. Their objective was to reach the Meuse River by nightfall on December 16, but the infantry regiment assigned to clear the route had been halted at Lanzarote Ridge by 18 American soldiers. Kampfgruppe did not reach Lanzarote until midnight on December 17, 16 hours behind schedule. That delay rippled through the entire German offensive plan. The northern wing of the Battle of the Bulge, designated by Hitler as the main effort, lost critical momentum on the first day. Instead of advancing 60 miles toward Antwerp as planned, the 1st SS Panzer Division managed less than 10 miles before encountering reinforced American positions. German commanders paused their advance after capturing WWII's platoon. They believed the woods behind the American line concealed additional forces in armor. The heavy casualties suffered during 7 hours of fighting suggested significant defensive depth. German reconnaissance patrols moved cautiously through the forest, expecting tanks and reinforcements. They found empty woods, but the delay proved decisive. 1930 on December 16, 1944, Lyle WWII and his wounded platoon began their march into German captivity. They had held Lanzarote Ridge for more than 11 hours against 500 attacking paratroopers. They had inflicted 92 casualties while suffering 1 killed and 14 wounded. And they had delayed the main German armored thrust by 16 hours. But none of them knew that yet. As prisoners of war, they believed they had failed. The true significance of their stand at Lanzarote Ridge would not be understood for decades. 2 days later, German soldiers loaded WWII and his wounded platoon into boxcars at Ingenuity. 72 American prisoners were crammed into a single cattle car designed for 40 men. The train traveled east into Germany without food or water. Temperatures inside dropped below freezing. By Christmas Day, 7 men in WWII's car had died from wounds, exposure, or dehydration. The survivors were sent to prisoner-of-war camps at Nuremberg, Hammelburg, and Moosburg. WWII spent 5 months in German captivity. Conditions worsened as the Wehrmacht collapsed in early 1945. Food rations dwindled to thin soup once per day. Allied bombing targeted rail lines and supply depots near the camps. German guards grew increasingly hostile as defeat loomed. Many prisoners contracted hepatitis, dysentery, or pneumonia. When American forces liberated the camps in April 1945, WWII weighed 112 pounds, down from 165 on December 16. The soldiers of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon returned to the United States believing they had failed at Lanzarote. WWII considered the wounding of 14 men and the capture of his entire unit a complete tactical failure. He did not know his platoon had delayed the 1st SS Panzer Division by 16 hours. He did not know the northern wing of the Battle of the Bulge had fallen critically behind schedule because of their stand. He only knew he had been captured after his ammunition ran out. After the war, the platoon dispersed. Soldiers returned to civilian life across America. Lanzarote Ridge went undiscussed. The battle was overshadowed by larger engagements of the Bulge. Bastogne captured international attention. The Malmedy massacre led to war crimes trials. An 18-man reconnaissance platoon that held a ridge for 7 hours faded into obscurity. In 1965, the U.S. Army published a multi-volume history titled The Ardennes, The Battle of the Bulge. Historian Hugh Cole mentioned WWII's platoon only briefly. Private First Class William James, who had fought at Lanzarote, read the reference and was angered by the lack of recognition. He contacted WWII and urged him to seek proper acknowledgement.
Boo wrote to his former division commander, Major General Walter Lauer, requesting decorations for his men.
In June 1966, a Silver Star arrived in Boo's mailbox, but no one else was recognized. Boo refused to accept an individual medal when his entire unit had fought together. He launched a 15-year campaign to secure recognition for every soldier. Congressional hearings, letter-writing efforts, and interviews with military historians followed.
John Eisenhower documented the battle in the Bitter Woods. Columnist Jack Anderson wrote about the forgotten platoon.
Gradually, the historical importance of Lanzarote Ridge became undeniable. 18 men with a single Jeep-mounted machine gun had stopped 500 paratroopers for 7 hours and delayed an entire SS Panzer division on the critical first day of Germany's final offensive.
On October 26, 1981, the U.S. Army formally recognized the platoon's actions at Lanzarote Ridge.
Every member received decorations. 4 soldiers, including Boo, were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross.
5 received Silver Stars.
10 received Bronze Stars with V devices.
The entire platoon received the Presidential Unit Citation.
It became the most highly decorated American unit of its size for a single action in World War II. 37 years had passed between the battle and the recognition. Some soldiers had died without knowing their sacrifice was acknowledged. William James, who initiated the recognition effort, died in 1977 after 37 surgeries for wounds sustained at Lanzarote.
But the survivors finally understood they had not failed. They had achieved something extraordinary. If this story moved you, please hit the like button.
Every like helps share these forgotten stories.
Subscribe and turn on notifications.
We're preserving history one story at a time. Real people, real courage.
Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from.
You're helping ensure Lieutenant Boo and his 18 soldiers are remembered, not lost to silence.